In this exercise we are going to make a Minecraft style character and give it a rig and then paint a texture for it. So to make this easier so that we utilize or can utilize the camera and the lighting, so that we're basically using the default. So we want to use the default cube because that is a square object that is basically the size of the head that we need. But the head's dimensions are normally 8 by 8 sidebar, but we can see the default is 2 by 2 by 2. So a little trick that we can use to make this easier to build the basics of the character is to go into Scene Properties, access Units, and change the unit scale multiplier. So that's 1 at the moment. We can change that to 4 in this example, or in this case, and that will change the grid and make our dimensions relative to what we need, which is a cube that's 8 by 8 by 8. So that little trick is a quick way of using the defaults without messing around too much with units of measurement and making these the right size and changing the scale relative to the light sources and then all that sort of nonsense. But we can now use the default cube. So let's flip into front view, select the cube, use the widgets, so move, rotate, scale. Let's move that up out of the way. What we're going to do is duplicate this. So we need to Shift D or Object, Duplicate Object. It creates an instance. Press Escape just to reset. Hold Control. That snaps to the grid and just move it out of the way. Duplicate again. So Shift D or Duplicate. Escape, Control, and then Shift D again, or Menu, Escape, and then Control, and move that into place. So we've now got the basics of a head, body, leg, and arm. Let's just switch back into, so click, drag on the scene. I'm going to change the dimensions of these. So the head is 8 by 8 by 8, that's basically the large object. The torso is 8 by 4 by 12. Don't worry about its position at the moment. The arm is 4 by 4 by 12. And the leg is similarly 4 by 4 by 12. So let's go into front view and reposition these in the right place. So Control Grab, click, Control Grab, Control Grab, and Control Grab. So what we have is the basic elements that create the character. And what we're going to do is just set this up so that it has a material and an image that we can then paint. But we only need to do that to this one leg and one arm because the character, the Minecraft characters, use the same arm and leg texture for both arms and both legs. So that's flipped, duplicated and flipped for both the arms and the legs. So that's the basics of the character. So it's a head that's 8 by 8 by 8, a torso that's 8 by 4 by 12, an arm that's 4 by 4 by 12, and then a leg that's 4 by 4 by 12 also. What we want to do before we go any further is reset the meshes so the scaling is 1 for each of the X, Y and Z coordinates for each of our objects. So they differ slightly depending on what the object is, because we rescaled our basic cube. So for that we just select our object, object menu, apply, rotation and scale. So object, apply, rotation and scale. That resets it so that X, Y and Z is all 1. So do that for the arm. Rotation and scale. And again, watch the numbers. Apply, rotation and scale. So double check. And they're all set. So let's save the file. Template 1. Save. So we've got our basic mesh objects, our blocks. So all we need to do now is add a material. So material properties. We have a material that's assigned to the default cube, so we can use that, but if one was not available, we just click on the plus button or the new button that would be here and create a new material, and it populates it with properties. That's the preview. So let's just call this Minecraft. And that's literally all we need to do for this part of the material creation. We can change the base color if we want to. To see that, we need to switch to material preview. We're in solid mode by default, which is just a solid grey color. So for the actual image that's assigned to the object, I want to go into shading workspace. There is our preview. That's our character. And then we have the basic nodes of our material. So we've got principal BSDF and material output. To this, we just want to add texture, image texture. So add texture, image texture. Drop in an image texture. Now we can either open an image, a pre-existing image, or we can create one. So let's just create a new one for now. So click on new, call this skin, and its size is 64 by 32. So that's 64 pixels by 32 pixels. These are tiny images. Generated type, we want to set that to UV grid or color grid. This just makes it easy to see what's going on. And just click OK. And then connect color output to base color input. So click drag and connect that. So we'll get something like this. So for the purposes of Minecraft characters which use blocky textures, so if we look at this texture, we can see that it's actually slightly blurry because of the resolution of the image. So before we go any further, what we want to do is modify this material to clean that up so that we are looking at just pixels as opposed to anti-aliased blurring. So we want to be in material properties. Click on the arrow to the left of the base color. And then what we want to change is this option, linear. This is the interpolation. This is how the image is interpreted. So what we want to do is click on that and change that to closest. So we're swapping from linear to closest. And if we keep an eye on what the image is doing in the preview, we'll see a change. Linear, closest. And we can see that it becomes much clearer. And that's all we need to do. That's our preview again. So save the file at this point. File, save as, to. And that's all we need to do for the material. So the next step is UV unwrapping and UV mapping. So for that, we want to go into UV editing workspace. There's our character. I'm going to switch to material preview so that we can see what we're doing. And there is the tiny image and our UV mapping, or the default mapping that's assigned or associated with the cube. So this is our cube that's been deformed, which has obviously deformed the UV map as well. So if we select the head, object mode, edit mode, same again. So we need to modify the existing UV map. So we're going to use the UV map that's already there and remap it. So ordinarily we would unwrap this in a particular way, but Minecraft skins, when we paint the skin, Minecraft skins use a particular layout for the unwrapping or the mapping of each of the elements. So each component of the character is mapped to a specific area of the image. So we have to replicate that in order for this to function. So if we were using this to paint skins, so if we were using this as a dummy to paint skins, we have to be able to paint the skins to our texture and then import that into Minecraft and have it work correctly in terms of its assignment. So we want the left or the outside of the arm to be on the correct side, the front of the torso, and so on, to be in the right place. So we have to map the UVs relative to that. And the easiest way to do this is to select our object. So edit mode, we want to switch to face select. And then we're going to select individual faces. So select, and then from the UV menu, so either in the 3D view or the editor, the UV editor, UV unwrap, and that'll just remap that UV to the shape that we need. So we'll do that for all the surfaces. Let's just, so we can get to our object, let's move it out of the way for the minute. Unwrap, 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 and unwrap. So now select all, there's all the faces. What we can do, again, similarly, face select in the UV editor, press the G key or use the widgets again, so move, rotate, scale. Just move these to one side whilst we organize. Placement. So this is the outside, and this is usually positioned here. The front is here, the inside is here, and then the back is here. And we can test this later by loading in an image that's set up correctly relative to the Minecraft template, skin template. So one of the things we also want to do, UV snap to pixels, again because we're dealing with pixels, we're 64 by 32, we want these UVs to snap precisely to the pixels in order to have the image mapped correctly to our object and then subsequently in Minecraft to the character. So snap to pixels, we want corner. So UV snap to pixels corner. What this does, so if we just switch to vertex, we can now see that the vertex is snapping to the individual pixels. So the pixels of the image act as a grid. And we can just snap the UVs into place. What we also need to check is the orientation of the UVs. So this one is flipped. So what we're going to do, select the face, so face select, UV mirror X, so we can see that the image flipped on that UV. Same on this side, UV mirror X. So we also need to check that we are the right way up. So when we unwrap, Blender doesn't necessarily know which way up the UV is orientated, so we're going to use this white line at the bottom here as our orientation indicator, and that means that this face is upside down, so too is this face. So select those two. We can select them together as a UV, mirror, y-axis. What we should find now is that when these are selected, it now welds them all together as a unit. It automatically does that. And this is what we want. So we have to do that to all sides of our object. So that's the top. Rescale. Hold Control to snap to the grid. And move. Check the orientation. UV, mirror, Y. And it could be that the orientation or the rotation is the wrong way around as well. So, rotate. Like so. And flip. There we go. Can be a bit tricky to get the orientation correct. At the bottom face, that won't be connected to anything, because ordinarily it would be positioned down here if we were UV unwrapping this for something specific. But because this is for Minecraft, the top and the bottom faces are positioned together for efficiency. So we can move this into place, and then we can load in our skin to check the orientation. So we now have to repeat that for each of the body parts. So the leg, the torso, and the head. So let's just save the file so we have a restore point to go back to if needed. So as we can see, it's quite tricky to figure out which way round the UVs are supposed to be orientated relative to the image and each of the characters' components. And what we can do to alleviate that is go into Shading Workspace, and the material, click on the folder icon and load in a template image that's been set up to indicate how the UVs should be mapped to the image. So obviously it's going to be a bit wonky at the moment because we haven't properly unwrapped our objects. So back into UV editing. So using the arm, edit mode, there's the arm. So what we can do here is select all, and then using the widgets, because we're going to do a couple of moves at the same time, let's use the universal. That'll give us the widget that we can use to scale, and we can then scale our UVs, and we can see how that's appearing on the mesh. So drag select, move, move, move into position, move into position. So this indicates the front. This indicates the top, and of course we already know which side is which, so this face is the wrong way around, so I need to correct that. And flip it the right way around. So all we need to do now is the rest of them. So face, we don't necessarily need to unwrap because we are dealing with a very simple object. We can use our tools and just manually manipulate our UVs. I'm going to use the shortcut keys for this, so that's G, and just pull them into place. So we can tell orientation of that is wrong. So that's the right way up. We want to check that UVs are the right way around, and we should find that they will auto weld. So if we select the UV, it will move both faces that are currently being mapped. So that's okay. And then the back. And that's okay. So that's the torso. We also need to do the top of it. And that's the other way around. And the bottom. So front, front. So that's the torso. We could duplicate the arm for the leg and then move the UV that creates into position where it should be. But for the sake of clarity, we'll continue doing what we are doing, which is unwrapping the individual faces. That's outside. Front. That's welded. Inside. Back. And then top. And then bottom. And then same again, finally for the head. So that's the left. Front. check the welding, right, back. So if that happens, what we can do is just deselect that face that's linked, move the face that we're editing into position, and reselect, and we should find that linked, and then of course top. So select the edge this time, and then bottom. So that's the head. So let's just save this. Because we need to double check our UVs, because their legs in particular and the arms are identical in UVs, but they use specific positions in the image. So this is actually the leg, and this area is the arm. So this is the leg, and this is the arm. So we need to swap those UVs around. So we select our object, edit mode, select all the UVs, so all or the A key. Let's grab that, move it into position. It's not obviously going to make any difference because we're using the same images to identify the respective sides of the cubes, just to make it easy to make sure that we are correctly orientated. So that's the arm. Select all, and that's the leg. So let's just save that. And then now what we can do, because we've got these arms and legs correctly mapped, so we can select the arm, object, duplicate object, escape to reset, and then what we can do here is mirror it. I'm just going to move this over here so that it's easier to see. So that's our object, mirror X global, and what that does is it inverts or flips, it mirrors our object so that when we move this across to the other side of our character, the outside face that we originally painted is also on the outside of the opposite side, the right hand side. Same for the leg. So select, duplicate, escape to reset. Let's just move this so that it's easier to see. So if we keep an eye on this face, object, mirror, X global in this case. Object, mirror, X global. That flips it, and then we can move it into position. But because we've mirrored those two objects, we need to reset these objects, which will turn the faces inside out, and we'll see that when we go to select our object, we go to object, apply, rotation and scale. So whenever we do a manipulation like this where we're mirroring, we need to set the orientation, and it's not done it here because if we go to material properties, down at the bottom, we want to enable backface culling. That just displays the mesh correctly relative to how the object is actually being rendered to screen. So it's now inside out because the faces have been reset after mirroring. So to fix that, edit mode, select all, and then we want to be in the mesh menu, mesh, normals, flip. We can use mesh, normals, flip, or recalculate outside. That forces all the faces to face outwards. At the moment they're facing inwards, like so. We need to do the same thing for the arm. So select, object, apply, rotation and scale. Then edit mode, select all, mesh, normals, recalculate outside. So that is now fixed and ready for rigging so that we can do some basic animation. So again, let's just switch to layout and then save. So creating a rig for something as simple as this is quite simple because we are using simple shapes and simple blocks to create the animation or create any animation that we might want to do. So just to make this easier so that we can see where the edges are of our objects, select Object Properties and we can enable wireframe, or in viewport overlays we can enable wireframe. That sets it globally versus per object. So this sets it on an object basis, so object by object, whereas this sets it globally, so everything is wireframed, so either or. So for our rig, so let's just double check everything's okay. For our rig we're going to drop in an armature. So we want to go to add, armature, and that will drop in a bone that we can't quite see at the moment because we've got our objects in the way. So in the outliner we can use these little eye icons to hide the various elements of our project, and there is our armature. So for this, to make this easier to see, or to make this easier to do, whilst our armature is selected, what we can do is in Object Properties we can enable in front, and what this does is it renders the armature in front of other objects, and this makes it easier to see and manipulate and edit and later on animate. So for our rig, all we really need, so let's switch to front view. All we need to do is enter edit mode, select the bone, so click on it, using our widgets. Just need to move this initial bone up to the torso, because that is essentially what this bone will be. This is the torso. Because what we're going to do is duplicate this to create the arms, the legs, and the head bone. And they'll all be linked to the torso. So for that, we select the bone, and as with our mesh objects, we can armature duplicate. So armature duplicate, or just Shift D is the shortcut. Armature duplicate, that creates a duplicate. Escape to reset, and then what we want to do with this, for this is the arm, we want to move this into position at approximately the shoulder of the character. So that's about there. Armature duplicate this bone, escape to reset, move this to the other side, duplicate, escape to reset, and move this down to the leg, then duplicate, escape, move this across to that leg, then duplicate, escape, move this to the head. That's the basic positions, and they're already in the right location relative to the depth of the character. If they weren't, what we would do is use the left or right view, and with our bones selected, we would move them into position relative to the center of mass, so center line down the center of our object. So that's the basic positions. What we now need to do is orientate the bones relative to how the limbs articulate. So we can either leave these as they currently are, with the bones sticking up like that, or we can orientate them relative to the limbs themselves. So for that, we can select the bones and then change the pivot point to individual origin. And this should, when we do rotate the bone around the root or origin of that particular bone. So we can use the rotate widget, and depending on the orientation, hold control, snap that round, select the bone, same again, same for the legs, like so. And then if we want, we don't need to, but if we wanted to, select the tail ends of the bones and extend them downwards to the bottom of the leg where the foot is. Same for the arms. Extend those down to the hands, the torso, up to the torso. Or if we wanted to do more complicated animations, so if we wanted the limbs to articulate, say at the elbows and the knees, so we give our character fake elbows and knees, what we can do is select the tails of each of the bones. Let's go into viewport front, and then we can extrude E additional bones. So armature extrude E, or we can use the extrude button. That will give us this tool, and we just click, drag, hold control if we want to snap to the increments, and drag down to create an extra set of bones. In this case, we're going to do a simple rig, so we don't need to do that, but that's how we would do that if we wanted to. So that's our armature's bones created and positioned. We now need to link them together. We don't need to do anything to the head, that's fine where it is. So we select our bones, switch to the widget tool, then in bone properties, expand relations, and there we should see a parent selector. so we can set the parent of the bones that we've got selected. So select, click on the bone icon, and then we can select the bone from the list. So as they're all named the same, let's do something before we do that. So select our bone. Again, we're still in bone properties. In the ID field, we can rename these. Torso, arm.l, arm.r, leg.l, leg.r, and then head. So now, when we select our bones, click on the list, we've got recognizable names that we can use. So torso, and we can see our relationship line has appeared. That's what we're looking for. So make sure we select the bone. And head. That's the relationship set up, and we can test this. Object mode, make sure our rig is selected. Pose mode, if we select the torso bone and just press the R key or the G key, we should find that all the bones move with the rig. But, of course, the meshes don't. So we need to set that up next. Object mode. Right, so for that, select our object. We need to do two things. Modifiers, add modifier, armature. Set the object, and this will be our armature. So click on the selector, armature. Do this for all their objects. And then second, to make this easier, let's select our armature. Go into Object Data Properties, Viewport Display. We want to enable names, make this easier to see. So those are the names of the individual bones. We're going to use these to create vertex groups for each corresponding mesh or object. As we're in Object Data Properties, that's where we need to be. So Object Data Properties, select our object, and then in Vertex Groups, we want to click the plus button. That creates a group. Double click. Rename this leg.l. It's case sensitive, so it needs to be exactly the same as the bone. Do the same for each of the objects. Leg.r. Arm.r. Torso. Arm.l. And then head. And then once we've done that, we want to be in edit mode. Select all. And then we've got a set of buttons now. So what we're going to do is click Assign, which assigns this group to that object. Assign, and then we can check using the select and deselect. So what we should find is the mesh is selected. So that's good. Edit mode, select all, assign, that's okay. Use the shortcut keys because it's quicker. Select all, assign, deselect, that's okay. Assign, that's okay. Assign, that's okay. Select all, assign, that's okay. So what we should find now, when we select the armature, switch into pose mode, and we press the R or the G key now, character moves. So what that means is that we can select our individual bones and the various parts of our character move. And that is a very simple rig for our character that we can create some animations for. So to recap, we've made the basic mesh, given it a material, we've given that material an image, so we mapped an image to that. Initially it was Blender's generated image, but as that's difficult to work with, we've imported a template or something that gives us an indicator as to how our mesh or the mesh object should be correctly mapped to make the skins work in Minecraft if we're using this as our tool to paint skins in 3D so we can see them in 3D. So once we've got that, we've then created our armature with the bones, rigged that up so that all the bones are connected, and then we've parented, or in this case it's an armature modifier, and we've used vertex groups to make everything link up so it moves and can be animated. So that's the rigging of our character. So let's save this. And do a little quick animation. So we can either use the animation workspace, or because this is a relatively simple character and the animation sequences would be relatively simple, all we need to do is just change the timeline editor at the bottom to the dope sheet, and then change the dope sheet to the action editor. So this is our timeline. This is the timeline scrubber or marker. This indicates the frame that we're at, and all we need to do is switch to pose mode. So select the armature, switch to pose mode, select a bone, move it so we can use our widgets depending on what we want to do. Let's just do a rotate. So we can rotate it, select our bones, so shift click to select both of them if we've moved more than one, and then from the pose menu, animation, insert keyframe. So the shortcut key for this is the letter I. I'm using this quite a bit for animation. So pose, animation, insert keyframe. This will give us the insert keyframe menu, and generally speaking, depending on what it is that we're doing, we just want location and rotation, or location, rotation and scale if we are doing something that changes the shape and size of our selection based on what the bone is doing. And what that will do is it'll drop in a keyframe marker into the timeline. So if we expand the summary, we can see that we've got arm.r and arm.l marked to the timeline, so that's a keyframe. Click drag, move the scrubber to frame 30. Let's move those down, just a simple animation. Press the I key, I for insert. Same thing again. And there we have a simple animation. What we can do to make this loop so it repeats, move back to frame 1, make sure our bones are selected, pose, copy pose, Control C, move the scrubber to frame 60, pose, paste pose, pose, paste pose. So that's pose, copy, pose, paste, and that's Control C and Control V. Paste the pose, and we have to insert keyframe. So now we have a looping animation that, if we go into output properties, we can set our frame range. So end would be 60. Enter. That shortens the timeline, so it highlights the frame range. And if we press the space bar, we get our very simple animation. Press space bar again to stop. We can rename this if we want. Activate the shield, so this has a fake user to keep it in place in the file. Because what we can do now is create a new action that duplicates this sequence. We can just call this wave, and we can create another sequence. So let's reset this, select the bone, pose, clear transform, all. Have to insert the keyframe. Do the same for the other frames that we've marked. Insert, pose, clear transform, all, insert. So we've now got a second animation. It's just a wave. If we want to see all the bones, regardless as to whether they've been animated or not, what we can do is disable this option, only show selected, and that will show all the bones that have pose data associated with them. So that is a very simple animation. And again, any new sequences we create, press the shield button to activate the fake user, so that when we click on the browse option, we have this little F that indicates fake user, which will keep this data in the file. If we don't do this and we're creating lots of animations, they can be lost because they don't have a user, which Blender thinks is an unused block of data, so it can be lost. So let's just save this, and that is our Minecraft character created in Blender, rigged with a simple animation.